The use of toys during training versus food rewards. We find in the initial stages of teaching a new behavior, we prefer to use food over toys, simply because we find for many dogs, the toys are overly stimulating for the animal, which makes it very hard for the animal to process the behaviors that we're trying to teach. With the food, it also allows us to lure the dog into the correct position. Whereas if you try to do that with a toy, it's almost impossible because the dog is more concerned about the reward itself as opposed to what it is you're trying to teach it. So initially, with the use of toys, it makes it quite easy to manipulate the dog into the correct position. Later on, we'll turn to toys for building intensity. So once the dog learns the desired behavior, now to get more drive or enthusiasm while executing the behavior, the toy allows for that type of behavior to happen. However, there are some dogs where their preference for the food reward outweighs their preference for the toys. And when we have a dog that exhibits that type of behavior, we tend to use a low value food reward simply because it helps to bring the drive down, once again allowing the dog to process the necessary behavior. Also, the food allows us to continue a behavior. So instead of always having to break and play, with the use of the food, let's say for example, if we're teaching the dog to heel, we can continually reinforce the dog with the food during the actual act of healing. Whereas if we were to use the toy, we would literally have to stop, break and play, and then go back into the behavior again. When working with our dog and using rewards, I usually explain to our handlers that ideally you want to exploit the reward that is most valuable to the animal. And what I mean by that, simply put, once behaviors are attained by the animal, we then want to work with a primary reward, something the dog really desires, as opposed to something that he just takes. Simply because we find that we will have consistency with the behavior every time, as opposed to if we use a low value reward, he may do it at times, he may not do it at times, dependent on the circumstance. Usually when we start to work with distractions, this is where you'll see the value of using a high value reward, or as I call it, a primary reward for the dog. Especially if you're in, let's say, any type of working dog sport, only then will you appreciate the use of the primary reward, because usually the use of the primary reward guarantees behaviors. Targeting. When using food, targeting is very important, especially when you're now teaching new positions or behavior. The way in which you hold the food will dictate the position that the dog gives you. And keep in mind, when using food, the closer the food is to the nose of the dog, the stronger the attraction, which makes it easier to manipulate the dog into position. But ultimately, we have to be very cognizant of how we hold the food when we're working with the dog. When we're teaching the frontal position, the recall, and we need the dog to come in straight and sit directly in front of us, I usually instruct my handlers to take the bait and lodge it between the thumb and the forefinger, and have it, when we call the dog, that we point the food out or lure the dog in, drawing the food towards you with the thumb being held straight and then ultimately facing the ground. And what will happen is the dog will come in, hit the head, and we just draw it in like a magnet and bring it into the correct position. And once we have that dog in position, then we mark, reward, and release. But again, when we're teaching the behaviors, we have to be very cognizant of how we hold it. If we hold it in such a way where the food is pointing somewhat off to the side as we're calling the dog in, where do you think the dog's going to end up? Off to the side, simply because he's chasing the food. So for creating proper habits, it's very important that we remember exactly how to hold our hands when working with the dog. So biomechanics is everything when working with food and targeting. The toy is only as effective as the handler that is using it. What I mean by that, simply put, we can have a toy and use our toy every day when working with our dog, but if we're utilizing the same pattern, when I say the same pattern, the same way in which we bring out the toy, deliver the toy, get the dog to chase the toy, after a while, the toy loses some of its value. The dog becomes bored. It's not as exciting. So when using the toy, I explain to our handlers, try to be unpredictable. The toy is no different than prey, like a rabbit or a squirrel. And vermin seldom move in the same direction, especially when being chased. And this is what makes it very stimulating for your dog. So if you can picture it that way when using your tug or your ball on the rope, and treat it like vermin and become very unpredictable to your dog, and even make noise when you're playing with your dog, it's going to really help to keep the value of the toy that much stronger. And the performance itself is going to be that much more intense. But if we keep utilizing the same patterns when we're working with the dog and not changing it up, after a while you'll see a decrease in performance. And all that is because, again, we've not made it interesting for the dog. It's lost value now. So keep in mind, the toy is only as effective as the handler that is utilizing it. Try also to utilize different rewards. Not always the same toy, not always the same bait. By mixing it up, keeping it interesting for the dog, it'll help to maintain intensity during your training sessions. Whether it be every other day, every other week, try to change up the rewards. Okay, so concluding our video in regards to motivation, keep it simple. Whether we are training for sport, for the real world, I used to do movie work, we used to do still pictures, we had to figure out what motivated the dog to give us the desired behavior. And when we realized or we figured out what it was, we would exploit that. And that's just keeping it simple. I find sometimes we overthink it, and we really shouldn't, because the dogs usually tell you, they're usually very honest with their opinions. So when working with your dog, try and figure out what really drives him, and when you figure it out, exploit it. Remember, don't overuse it. Sometimes we like to switch it up every so often. So, 1 week I might use this particular toy, another week we'll go back to that toy. This way we keep it fun and interesting for the dog. Just like you and I, they do lose interest, and we want to keep them up. With that said, that's the end of our video. I hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up, and please subscribe to our channel. Have a good one.